What would it mean if somewhere, far beyond the reach of our fragile world, a machine has been running for longer than life has walked upon this earth? A machine that has endured more than 2 billion years of storms, collisions, and cosmic silence. And yet, it still works. Who built it? Why? And what could possibly demand endurance on such a scale? These are not the questions of science fiction alone. They are questions whispered by data, echoes caught in the static of telescopes, faint clues that point towards something so vast that it destabilizes our entire understanding of existence. Imagine this. Our own civilization has only held the torch of technology for little more than a century. We believe ourselves advanced, and yet in the blink of cosmic time, our towers crumble, our machines corrode, our inventions grow obsolete. But out there, orbiting a star that itself is ancient, rests a planet scarred and broken, and within its heart pulses a rhythm that has never faltered. The thought itself is enough to make us tremble. Because a thing that survives when everything else falls away is not simply an artifact, it is a message, a defiance against entropy, a declaration that someone, or something, once reached into the deep future and left behind a beacon. The first sign did not come from a spacecraft, but from the faint whispers of radio waves. Astronomers noticed peculiar regularities buried in cosmic noise, patterns too exact to dismiss as chance. At first, they thought it might be pulsars, those dense corpses of stars that rotate with clockwork precision, beaming signals across the galaxy. But pulsars decay. Their rhythm slows. This signal did not. It had the steady pulse of intention, a signal locked into harmony, as if refusing to degrade with time. And then came the realization. This source was fixed upon a solitary planet, a silent rock orbiting a dim sun, too far from habitable zones to nurture life, too barren to host oceans or forests. And yet, something there was still breathing electricity into the void. What is it we fear when we gaze upon such discoveries? Perhaps it is not the alien itself, but the scale of endurance. We fear because we know our own limits. Our monuments last centuries, our books perhaps a few millennia if they are guarded, but 2 billion years? 2 billion years ago, Earth itself was unrecognizable. Continents were still drifting. The first multicellular organisms had not yet appeared. Dinosaurs, humans, civilizations, all of that belonged to a future still locked away. And yet while our world was nothing but microbial mats and shallow seas, something elsewhere had already achieved an engineering so great, so unfathomable, that it would still be functioning when entire species rose and turned to dust. Scientists debated in hushed tones whether it was possible. Could any technology endure so long? The answer seemed to mock our imagination. Everything we build is destined to fall. Cities sink. Satellites decay. Even the most carefully sealed machines corrode, their circuits eaten by time. Entropy is the only universal law that never breaks. And yet, here was a violation. Here was an object that laughed at decay. If this was a machine, then it had either found a way to cheat entropy, or it had been designed so deeply in harmony with physics that decay itself became irrelevant. Was it consuming energy? Was it harvesting the star, or the planet itself? Or had it found a reservoir so vast and hidden that it could sip gently upon it for billions of years without exhaustion? The telescopes kept turning toward it. Each reading carried a hint of purpose, but never enough to solve the puzzle. Some frequencies suggested rotation, like gears or cycles repeating endlessly. Others whispered like encoded patterns, data woven into rhythms we could not translate. We tried to match it with mathematics, with universal constants, hoping to find a bridge into understanding. Was it counting prime numbers? Was it spelling out messages we could not yet recognize? The silence remained unbroken, a silence not of absence, but of refusal. It was as if the machine acknowledged observation, yet declined to explain itself. The planet itself told its own strange story. Probes revealed a world battered and lifeless. Its surface cracked with canyons and pockmarked by craters. No water, no atmosphere thick enough to breathe. A planet abandoned by nature. And yet, deep within its crust, sensors caught unusual flows of heat, lines of thermal energy too straight to be geological. Beneath the stone, beneath the ruins of impact, lay corridors that glowed faintly, like veins in a body still alive. When seismic scans were run, they revealed hollows far too regular, chambers nested like organs, structures that echoed with faint vibrations, mechanical heartbeats that had been running since before mammals even existed. And the most disquieting fact of all, the system was still symmetrical, still ordered, as though it had never once broken down. To imagine such an endurance is to confront the limits of our own minds. We often speak of permanence, but our permanence is an illusion of scale. The pyramids feel eternal, and yet they are younger than the written word. Rome feels ancient, and yet it crumbled only yesterday compared to the age of stars. Even our Earth will not endure. In another 5 billion years, our sun will swell, oceans will boil, and the crust will shatter. Nothing lasts forever, and yet, here, impossibly, something was built with the very intention of outlasting forever. We are left asking, for what purpose? Who needs a machine that runs across such time? Who requires endurance that eclipses the lifespan of planets? Some theorized that it was not a machine in the way we imagine machines. Perhaps it was not made of circuits and gears, but of self-repairing matter, materials that flow and regenerate like flesh, only on the scale of rock and metal. Perhaps the entire planet itself had been turned into a device, its crust nothing more than the shell of a deeper engine. Others whispered that it was not built for work at all, but for memory, that within those cycles turning endlessly in silence lay the stored thoughts of beings now extinct, their whole existence encrypted in motion so that long after their bodies were gone, their knowledge would endure. Perhaps the machine was not doing, but remembering, not building, but preserving. A library built not of paper or stone, but of eternity itself. But if that were true, why had it never spoken? Why did it never announce itself, never reach across the void to say, "We are here"? Perhaps because the machine was never meant for us. Perhaps it was meant only for those who came before, or those who would come after, for minds not yet born, for civilizations that will rise long after humanity itself is dust. And if that is true, then we have become trespassers in a story not our own, accidental witnesses to a monument built for someone else. The machine becomes not a message to us, but a mirror that asks, how long will your creations last? How long before the ruins of your world vanish completely? And when they do, will there be anything left of you but whispers in the static? The discovery shook more than science. It shook faith, philosophy, identity itself. For if such endurance is possible, then our notions of death, of time, of finality are illusions. What if the universe itself is seeded with such devices, each one a candle burning through the eons, ensuring that memory is never truly lost? We cling to our stories, to our names, to our fleeting moments. Yet, here is proof that something can last not just beyond generations, but beyond epochs. And in that realization lies both comfort and terror. Comfort, because perhaps nothing is ever truly erased. Terror, because perhaps nothing is ever allowed to die. When scientists first revealed their findings, the world was divided. Some dismissed it as error, as the projection of meaning upon noise. Others insisted it was proof of alien engineering. But beyond the debate, beyond the politics and the headlines, the fact remained. A planet holds a secret that outlives everything we know. And as we watch, as we listen, we cannot escape the question that haunts us most. Is this machine waiting for us, or waiting for something else? And if it is waiting, what happens when the waiting ends? Consider the scale of patience required to even imagine such a creation. Humanity measures time in hours and days, sometimes in decades, if we are generous. A civilization might think in terms of centuries, but billions of years, billions, demand a mind that thinks not in moments, but in eternities. What kind of beings could stretch their vision across such spans? Did they know, as they built, that their own lives would vanish like sparks against the immensity of time, and yet still continue to build for a future they would never see? Is that not the truest definition of faith? Not faith in gods, but in endurance itself. Picture the world in which the machine was born. When its foundations were laid, Earth itself was little more than a garden of microbes, creatures without sight or thought, the air thick with carbon dioxide, the ocean shallow with life that had no language. And yet, light years away, intelligence was bending stone into code, metal into memory. constructing something that would outlive not only itself, but everything around it. If the builders looked at their own skies, did they see Earth as a pale dot of no significance, never knowing that billions of years later, from that dot, another species would look back and discover their work? In this way, the machine binds us to them, two civilizations separated by oceans of time, connected by the endurance of an artifact. As probes drifted closer, questions grew darker. Why does it still run? Machines, like hearts, are built for purpose. They beat to circulate blood, to transmit energy, to store memory. What happens when a machine beats for 2 billion years? Is it still carrying out a task that matters? Or is it repeating endlessly a duty long since emptied of meaning? Perhaps its creators are extinct, their world shattered, their names unspoken even in their own galaxies, and yet their machine carries on, faithful to a cause erased from history. Is that not the purest tragedy? That devotion might outlast even remembrance? Some researchers propose that the machine could be a guardian, designed not to announce itself, but to protect. Perhaps it holds closed a door that must never open. Perhaps it maintains a balance, a planetary-scale lock keeping something dangerous imprisoned beneath the crust. A prison whose jailers have long perished, leaving only the locks intact. What then does it mean that we are watching, measuring, and perhaps interfering? Would our curiosity be the key that undoes a seal never meant to be broken? Others imagined it as a transmitter, a constant beacon casting signals into the void, like a lighthouse upon a dead shore. If so, who was it calling to? Its makers? Their descendants? Or something beyond even them? Could it be that the universe itself is seeded with such devices, each one a point in a hidden network, a cosmic web of machines that whisper across eons? And if so, then are we merely eavesdroppers on a conversation that was never ours? The closer we look, the more the line blurs between science and philosophy. To build for billions of years is not an act of engineering alone. It is a statement about existence. It is a hand stretched across time itself. Every beat of the machine's heart says, "We were here, and we endured." And perhaps it also says, "You too may endure." But for us, fragile creatures who measure meaning in decades, such endurance feels alien, even inhuman. It challenges the very idea of mortality. If a machine can outlast stars, then what excuse do we have for believing in endings? When the machine was revealed, stories spread among ordinary people. Some called it the Watcher, a presence that had been observing Earth long before we were aware of ourselves. Some called it the Tomb, the last monument of a civilization that had chosen remembrance over oblivion. And some, whispering more darkly, called it the Seed, something not finished, but waiting, something that might not reveal its purpose until conditions were finally right. And if that is true, then perhaps our discovery was never an accident. Perhaps our awareness was the signal it had been waiting for. What frightens us most may not be the machine itself, but the mirror it holds up. When we imagine our own species surviving 2 billion years, the image falters. We struggle to even imagine 1 million years of continuity, let alone billions. Our wars, our climate, our fragile political divisions all remind us that we are creatures of impermanence. And yet, this artifact suggests the opposite, that endurance is possible. That memory can be carved not into fragile pages or fleeting data, but into the bones of a planet itself. It whispers that there is another way to exist, not as a flicker, but as a fire that refuses to die. Think of all that has happened in the time this machine has run. Continents have risen and fallen. Oceans have formed and evaporated. Stars have ignited, lived, and collapsed into darkness. Galaxies have collided in slow dances spanning millions of years, and through it all, this one machine has kept moving, a solitary metronome marking time in the void. What mind could endure knowing that it would never see the completion of its work? And yet, perhaps that is the true meaning of such endurance, that purpose does not require an ending. That motion itself becomes the meaning, even when no one is left to see it. The discovery has left us with a choice. Do we treat it as an artifact to be studied, a puzzle to be solved with instruments and equations? Or do we allow ourselves to recognize its deeper challenge, that it asks us to confront what it means to live and to last? The machine exists as proof that something greater than us has already answered those questions. And whether or not we decipher its function, we cannot escape the reflection it casts. A reflection that says, "You are brief, but you do not have to be. You are fragile, but fragility is not destiny. Even in a universe ruled by entropy, endurance is possible. And somewhere, something has already proven it." So we end the first chapter with the same question with which we began. What does it mean for a machine to run for 2 billion years? Perhaps it means that the universe itself is not silent. Perhaps it means that memory can be eternal. Or perhaps, most unsettling of all, it means that we are not the first to wonder, not the first to fear, and not the first to build something meant to outlive the stars. And if that is true, then the story is only beginning. Because when a machine waits for billions of years, it is never waiting for nothing. It began not with a blinding revelation, but with a whisper, one so faint that it nearly disappeared into the background of the universe. In the endless ocean of static that fills every telescope, there are patterns, bursts from pulsars, echoes from quasars, the faint microwave afterglow of the Big Bang itself. Astronomers are trained to separate noise from meaning, to pull order from the chaos. And yet, sometimes the most unsettling discoveries arrive in the subtlest ways. The machine revealed itself not through grandeur, but through a pulse that should not have been there, a rhythm buried deep, as though the planet itself were speaking under its breath. At first, it looked like nothing. A small irregularity, a faint uptick in the data from a planetary survey, the kind of anomaly that is usually written off as instrument error. The universe is filled with false signals, phantoms born of interference, cosmic rays that strike detectors, software glitches, but the irregularity returned, and then it returned again. And soon it became undeniable that something beneath that barren planet was pulsing with a precision so steady, so timeless, that no natural process could explain it. The pulse was not constant, and yet it repeated. It flickered in harmonics, layered like the chords of a song that no one had ever taught us to hear. Sometimes the intervals stretched across hours, sometimes days, yet always they returned to a baseline rhythm as if anchored to an eternal clock. Some astronomers joked that it was the heartbeat of the planet, but in the quiet of late-night observatories, others stopped laughing. Because there was no mechanism we knew that could explain it. Geology does not beat like a heart. Chemistry does not hold rhythm across billions of years. And biology? There was no biology left there. The planet was dead, which left only one answer. Something was running. Something that had been built, and it had been built to last. We called it noise at first. Always noise, because to admit otherwise was to accept something so far outside our frame of reference that it would unravel certainty itself. But science is relentless, and noise does not obey mathematics. When patterns emerge, when sequences hold, they must be acknowledged. And so, teams around the world began to analyze the pulse. They ran Fourier transforms, looking for hidden signals. They tested for repetition, for encryption, for anything that might resemble communication. And what they found unsettled them more deeply than any simple message could have. The signal seemed to fold upon itself. It repeated yes, but not in the simple way of a beacon. It was layered, recursive, like a language that referenced itself in ways too complex for us to decipher. It was less a sentence, more a song whose meaning lay not in the notes, but in the spaces between them. Some argued it must be a mistake. Surely no machine could last so long. Surely no civilization could design something to endure beyond extinction itself. But every test, every cross-check, only reinforced the truth. The signal was real. And more terrifyingly, it was old. The decay of isotopes in the planet's crust, the layering of craters upon its face, all confirmed its age. The machine had been running for longer than complex life had existed on Earth. Longer than forests, longer than bones, longer than memory. When our world was nothing but slime clinging to rocks, this thing had already been humming to itself in the dark. That knowledge was like a weight upon the chest, an oppression of perspective. Because if they could do this, whoever they were, then what did that make us? Children fumbling in the dark, building toys that would crumble before their builders even grew old. The more we studied, the more unsettling the patterns became. There were alignments with prime numbers, with constants like pi and e, but not in any straightforward sequence. They emerged sporadically, like whispers of recognition, as though the machine knew what we were looking for and offered only fragments. Too little to grasp, too much to dismiss. It was as if we were reading a book, written in a language with no alphabet, a script that shifted even as we tried to understand it. And somewhere deep inside, a suspicion began to grow. The machine was not simply sending, it was listening. The rhythm shifted ever so slightly when we attempted to send responses back. Not dramatically, not like a conversation, but subtly enough that some scientists swore it was intentional. Others dismissed it as coincidence, as noise folding into itself. But once the thought is born, that you are being heard, it cannot be undone. Governments grew interested. What began as a scientific curiosity became a matter of strategy, of secrecy, of fear. If the signal was truly artificial, then it was proof that intelligence had walked this path before us, perhaps long before us. The implications were staggering. It was no longer a question of whether we are alone. It was now a question of why they are gone, and why this machine remains. And perhaps more urgently, what is it waiting for? Because nothing continues for 2 billion years without purpose. Nothing runs without a function. Some feared it was a weapon, that the pulse was not a message, but a lock. A sequence meant to keep something bound beneath the planet's surface. The harmonics, some argued, resembled containment fields, patterns used to stabilize energy. If that was true, then what lay imprisoned there? And what would happen if the machine failed, or worse, if we tampered with it? Others imagined it as a beacon, endlessly transmitting a call to civilizations that no longer existed. A lighthouse casting its light into an empty sea. And yet, even a lighthouse serves a purpose. If this was calling, who was it calling to? And why had no one answered? The darkest theory of all was the simplest. Perhaps we were never meant to find it. Perhaps its builders had buried it, hidden it within the stone of that lifeless planet, so that it would run quietly, unseen, untouched. And yet, across the gulfs of time, across the scatter of starlight, we stumbled upon it anyway, like children opening a locked door without knowing why it was locked. And now that we had found it, the question hung in the air. Had the machine noticed us? And if it had, what came next? Whispers in the data became whispers in our minds. It was no longer only scientists who felt it. Artists painted it. Poets wrote of it. Dreamers lay awake at night imagining what kind of beings could leave such a relic behind. It slipped into our myths, our fears, our philosophies. Some claimed it was proof of immortality, that knowledge itself could be eternal. Others saw it as proof of futility, that all that endures is function without meaning, motion without end. In this way, the machine became more than discovery. It became a mirror, showing each of us not what it was, but what we feared it might be. Still the data streamed in. Still the pulse carried on, steady as the turning of galaxies. It did not care for our interpretations. It did not bend to our need for answers. It simply continued as it had always continued, its whispers too old, too vast, to bend toward our questions. And in that silence, in that refusal, we heard the truest terror of all, that the universe is not here to explain itself to us, that sometimes survival itself is the only message, and sometimes endurance is the only meaning. The debates became furious, almost violent in their intensity. Some insisted that we were witnessing the remnants of a civilization that had achieved mastery of time itself, embedding their last testament into the very bones of a planet. Others rejected the idea outright, claiming that nature could still surprise us, that perhaps we were simply mistaking geology for intelligence. But geology does not recite mathematics. Rocks do not count primes. Mountains do not echo constants from the edge of the universe. And yet, the pulse did. Steady, undeniable, impossible. Scientists broke into factions. One camp called it the Sentinel, a machine designed to watch, to record, perhaps even to judge. Another called it the Engine, an unfinished project left running, its function lost, but its operation eternal. Still others whispered of darker things, that the pulse was not neutral, but a warning, a sign to stay away. In hidden rooms, away from cameras and microphones, some even asked, what if it is not waiting to be found? What if it is waiting to be awakened? Governments classified much of the research. Data that had once been open to international collaboration was pulled behind locked servers, an invisible curtain of secrecy draped across the world. Publicly, they spoke of background anomalies, minimizing the discovery as if to shield the collective mind from panic. But in the laboratories and meeting halls where the truth could not be denied, the mood was one of quiet dread. Because if the machine truly had endured across 2 billion years, then humanity had just stumbled into a story much older than itself. And no one could predict how such a story would end. The pulse itself became a clock that we could not stop hearing. It infiltrated our dreams. Engineers imagined its cycles when designing new systems. Musicians used its rhythm as inspiration, creating symphonies built upon the alien beat. Philosophers wrote of it as proof that the universe was not chaos, but code, that life itself might be nothing more than a program seeded by machines like this one. Religious leaders interpreted it as the voice of the divine, a God that had chosen to speak not in words, but in endurance. And through it all, scientists wrestled with the simplest of facts. They did not know what it was or why it continued, and perhaps they never would. The more instruments we aimed at the planet, the stranger the findings became. The surface revealed scars consistent with colossal impacts, craters so deep they could swallow mountains. And yet, beneath those wounds, the pulse never faltered. It was as though the machine had been designed not only to last, but to survive catastrophe after catastrophe. It was indifferent to disaster, indifferent even to time itself. It kept going as galaxies spun and died, as stars were born and extinguished, as species across the cosmos lived their entire histories and were erased. Through all of it, the machine endured, whispering in its infinite monotony. And still, questions gnawed at us. Was the machine aware, or was it simply operating in blindness, locked into a cycle that had no beginning and no end? Did it know we were listening? When the pulses shifted ever so slightly in response to our probes, was that an acknowledgement or just coincidence? Our minds are wired to see intention, to hear voices in static, to imagine patterns where none exist. But sometimes, the patterns are real. And if they are real, then someone, something, is still there. Not alive, perhaps, but present, watching, waiting, listening. It is here that the story takes its most human turn. For though the machine lay light years away, silent in its endless duty, its presence changed us. It changed how we thought of history, of meaning, of ourselves. We realized that our greatest monuments, our longest traditions, were less than whispers compared to this endurance. Entire empires could rise and fall 1,000 times, and the machine would still be there, indifferent, unchanging. Compared to it, we were mayflies dancing for a single night. And yet, perhaps, it also offered hope. If endurance was possible, then perhaps nothing was ever truly lost. Perhaps memory itself could survive the death of worlds, and perhaps we too could carve our story into eternity. But hope is fragile, and fear is louder. For some began to imagine that the machine was not passive, that its pulse was not only a rhythm, but a countdown. What if it was measuring not just time, but the interval until something was meant to occur? What if it was not waiting to be found, but waiting to act? Theories spread like wildfire. Some said it was a failsafe, a mechanism designed to reactivate when intelligence finally noticed it. Others suggested it was a seed, carrying within it the beginnings of life, ready to be unleashed upon a barren galaxy. And the darkest voices of all whispered, what if it is a weapon? What if the 2 billion years were not endurance, but preparation? Yet the machine offered no answers. Its whispers remained steady, indifferent to our panic. It did not accelerate when threatened, did not slow when ignored. It simply carried on, as though our attention meant nothing at all. And perhaps that was the most terrifying revelation of all, that we were irrelevant, that the machine had not been built for us and would not explain itself to us, no matter how desperately we begged. So we kept listening. Night after night, telescope after telescope, we leaned into the silence of the cosmos, searching for meaning in whispers too old for language. And in doing so, we found ourselves caught between awe and terror, between reverence and fear. For the machine was not just a discovery, it was a question. And like all the greatest questions, its power was not in the answers it offered, but in the way it changed the ones who dared to ask. Across history, humanity has always looked to the skies for meaning. The Babylonians traced the movements of stars to predict the will of gods. The Egyptians carved the Eye of Horus as a symbol of the ever-watchful heavens. The Maya and the Vedic seers saw cycles of time woven into celestial rhythms, believing the cosmos itself was alive, listening. What would they have thought if they knew that in truth, buried in the cold stone of a distant planet, a machine was indeed listening across billions of years? Would they have called it a deity, an oracle, a cosmic judge? Or would they, like us, have trembled at the silence, at the thought that the heavens are not empty, but occupied by something that refuses to die? And what of us, modern creatures with satellites and data models, still driven by the same ancient hunger for meaning? We cannot bear silence. We demand that the universe explain itself, and when it does not, we invent explanations. Perhaps that is why the machine unsettles us so deeply. It gives us a pattern, a structure, but no story. It refuses to satisfy our need for closure. It offers us endurance without reason, survival without context. And in that void, we project everything: hope, terror, myth, despair. The machine is not a message, it is a canvas. And upon it, we paint the fears of our age. Some paint it as a savior, the last gift of a civilization long gone. Some paint it as a curse, a trap waiting to be sprung. And some, perhaps most hauntingly, paint it as nothing at all, a machine stripped of meaning, running because it was built to run, a monument to futility. For what greater horror could there be than to discover that endurance itself can become hollow, that survival can be stripped of purpose, leaving only motion without end? In late-night conferences, scientists confessed to one another that the data had changed them. They spoke of staring at the waveforms, at the recursive pulses folding upon themselves, and feeling not curiosity, but dread. Not because the machine was hostile, but because it was indifferent. And indifference on a cosmic scale feels like cruelty. If something can survive 2 billion years and yet care nothing for those who find it, then what does that say about us, about our hunger for meaning? Perhaps the universe does not hate us. Perhaps it does not love us. Perhaps it simply does not notice us at all. And so, the whispers continued. Not loud enough to answer, not quiet enough to ignore. They carried on, steady and endless, as though mocking our impatience. They reminded us that endurance itself can be a form of communication, a declaration that need not be spoken. We are here, and we will outlast you. And perhaps that is all the machine has ever needed to say. From a distance, it was nothing more than another rock in the endless graveyard of planets, a gray world circling a faint star, forgotten by the galaxy. It bore no oceans, no forests, no weather to speak of. Its atmosphere was thin, a fragile veil unable to protect it from radiation or impacts. Its face was scarred, carved by billions of years of collisions with asteroids. Its mountains shattered, its valleys dust-choked. It was a world abandoned by time, a planet of stone and silence. And yet, beneath that silence, something stirred. Something pulsed with the patience of eternity. The first probes that approached recorded images that looked, at first glance, lifeless, a landscape of desolation. Craters upon craters, as though the world had been pummeled mercilessly for eons. The surface temperature swung violently, baking under the star's light, freezing in its absence. Nothing alive could endure such extremes, and indeed, nothing did. Yet, when the probes began to drill their signals deeper, when they scanned the crust and mapped the subsurface, they discovered anomalies too precise to dismiss. Lines of heat that ran straight for hundreds of kilometers. Magnetic fields that did not align with the geology. Seismic echoes that returned not randomness, but rhythm. The planet's silence was a mask, and beneath that mask lay the most unsettling truth. The world itself was hollowed into structure. Imagine peeling away the crust of that planet like the shell of an egg, and finding within not molten rock, but corridors, chambers, conduits. Vast hollow spaces shaped with symmetry that nature does not create. Some were miles wide, stretching into caverns so immense that entire cities could rest inside them. Others were tight, labyrinthine, as though designed for pathways, for circulation. And all of them vibrated with the same pulse, a deep thrum that resonated through the rock, a mechanical heartbeat too steady to be chance. The planet was not a grave, it was a body. And its body still lived. The deeper we peered, the stranger it became. Infrared scans showed networks of warmth running like arteries, feeding from a core that radiated faint but steady energy. Unlike Earth, whose molten center shifts and churns, this planet's core pulsed in exact regularity, as though calibrated by design. It was not chaos, but precision. Not geology, but engineering. It was as if someone had taken the raw matter of a planet and sculpted it into a machine, its stone skeleton fused with metal veins, its heart still beating after billions of years. The probes descended further, sending radar into the crust, mapping the voids hidden within. What they revealed was staggering. Layer upon layer of geometry, patterns repeating at scales too vast for architecture, and yet too deliberate for chance. There were spirals kilometers wide, interlocking hexagons, rings nested within rings like gears meshing together. The structures echoed mathematical principles. The golden ratio, Fibonacci spirals, symmetry so exact it seemed to mock the imperfections of human design. And within those shapes, the pulse continued. A rhythm, steady, eternal, as though the planet itself were breathing in silence. Some scientists proposed that the planet had once been stripped bare, its natural geology carved away and replaced with structure. Others argued that it had been constructed from the beginning, that it was not a planet at all, but a disguised machine, a world built to masquerade as rock. If true, that would mean its builders had engineered not just cities or machines, but entire planets, sculpting matter on a cosmic scale. The thought was unbearable in its implication. We are infants by comparison. Our skyscrapers, our satellites, our towers of steel are toys beside the ability to bend a world into function. The planet's silence became its most deafening feature. We expected signals, messages, evidence of its makers, but there was nothing but the pulse. The surface lay empty. No ruins, no monuments, no carvings, no life. Only stone and dust above, and precision below. It was a paradox too sharp to ignore. Something had gone to infinite lengths to build this world, and then abandoned it, or been erased. All that remained was the machine itself, faithful beyond reason, loyal to a purpose that no longer had a witness. The more we studied, the more terrifying questions emerged. Why design something to last 2 billion years? What could possibly require that scale of endurance? Civilizations rise and fall in tens of thousands of years at most. Species endure for millions. Stars themselves live only billions. To build something that continues through it all is to reach beyond the scale of nature itself. Did its makers hope to survive through memory? Did they build it as a monument, a tomb, a library? Or was it not meant for themselves at all, but for whoever would come after, like a message carved into stone that says, "We were here, and we endured"? Yet there was another possibility, whispered in dark corners of scientific meetings. What if the machine was not meant to be found? What if the silence of its surface was deliberate, a camouflage to hide what it carried within? If that were true, then we had broken a seal not meant to be broken. The silence was not absence, it was warning. A planet that should have been forgotten, and yet we had dragged it into the light. And if the machine within it still lived, still waited, then perhaps our discovery was the very thing it had been designed to anticipate. To study the planet was to confront our own fragility. On Earth, nothing endures. Mountains crumble, oceans shift, civilizations dissolve into dust. But here was a machine so vast it had become geology itself. A machine that did not care for extinction, that did not even notice the passing of time. Its silence mocked us, reminded us that all our striving, all our monuments and dreams are fleeting. We build for tomorrow. They built for eternity. And eternity is not kind. As we probed deeper into its mysteries, one truth became impossible to deny. This was not simply a planet with a machine. This was a machine that had chosen to wear the disguise of a planet. And in its silence, it whispered to us the most haunting truth of all. The universe may not only contain intelligence older than us, it may contain intelligence that has already fused itself into the bones of worlds, erasing the line between matter and mind, between stone and thought. The machine did not wait for our belief. It continued as it always had, beating beneath the silence, as if to remind us. Some things endure not because they wish to be seen, but because they were built never to die. The first lander touched down on a plain that seemed no different from any cratered desert, its dust regolith fine as ash, its stones fractured from the violence of impacts that had scarred the world for eons. But as its instruments deployed, strange inconsistencies emerged. The crust reflected signals as though hollow. The vibrations from its landing legs echoed unnaturally, bouncing back in patterns that suggested emptiness beneath solid stone. It was as though the planet itself was an echo chamber, a drum whose skin was rock, but whose body was hollow. The lander's camera panned across endless plains of gray, silent and dead. Yet its sensors insisted that below this graveyard stretched an order too precise, a symmetry that nature alone could never achieve. Days passed as the lander mapped the horizon. There were no mountains rising with jagged irregularity, only flattened ridges, straight lines etched across the landscape as though drawn by unseen hands. The craters themselves, once assumed to be scars of random violence, aligned in peculiar ways, as though their placement had been subtly guided. It was as if the planet itself was wearing camouflage, chaos painted on its surface to disguise the order below. And when the lander drilled into the surface, its instruments struck something unexpected. A material unlike stone, harder than steel, fused seamlessly into the surrounding geology. It was not metal as we know it, but something that resisted decay, something built to endure, a skeleton that could not be broken by the passage of time. When word spread of the findings, humanity's imagination ignited. Could this planet itself have been an artifact, a machine world disguised in stone? Science fiction had long played with such ideas. Dyson spheres, worlds hollowed to house civilizations. But here it was, not fiction, but fact. And it was older than imagination itself. 2 billion years of silence wrapped around an engine that refused to die. The planet's skies told their own story. Its thin atmosphere offered no protection against the star's harsh radiation, leaving the surface bathed in ultraviolet fury. Dust storms rose only to collapse again into stillness, their movements sluggish in the weakened air. Night brought cold so sharp it could crack metal, while day boiled the exposed surface. This was not a world meant to harbor life. It was a husk, a shell, a perfect place to hide a secret that must outlast time itself. And perhaps that was the point. Not to create a home, but to create a mask, a disguise so complete that only the most determined gaze could pierce it. Probes that dug deeper uncovered chambers vast enough to stagger the imagination. Caverns the size of continents stretched into darkness, lined with structures that hummed faintly as if resonating with the machine's pulse. Walls smoother than glass, unscarred by age. Conduits that seemed to flow with energy, yet not with any current we understood. And in some chambers, there were echoes, reflections of signals that had been bouncing for millennia, like whispers trapped in stone, endlessly circling. It was as though the planet itself was not only alive, but listening, its hollow spaces designed to carry sound, vibration, communication. The silence outside grew oppressive. Astronauts who monitored the data spoke of unease, of staring into the planet's images and feeling watched. It was not logical. Nothing stirred on the surface. No eyes looked back. And yet, the thought could not be shaken. The silence was not absence. It was attention. The planet waited. Not actively, not visibly, but in the way a locked door waits, or a sealed vault, or a heart that beats long after its owner is gone. Some saw it as a tomb, the last resting place of a civilization that had built their memory into stone. Others saw it as a seed, a device that would awaken when conditions were right, when another intelligence had finally found it. And the most fearful suggested something else entirely, that it was not a tomb or a seed, but a prison, that beneath its crust, within those chambers, something had been trapped long ago, something that must never be released. The machine was not a monument, but a lock. And if that was true, then our probes were not explorers. They were intruders, picking at chains forged by hands far older than ours. The planet's stillness magnified the fear. Earth is noisy, winds, oceans, quakes, storms, life. But this place gave nothing. No sound, no movement, only dust shifting lazily in low gravity. Its silence was unnatural, the silence not of emptiness but of control, as though the planet itself had been designed to smother chaos. Every part of it whispered, "Nothing changes here, nothing dies, nothing ends." And perhaps that was the greatest terror of all. Not that the machine endured, but that its endurance had drained the planet of everything else. It had become eternal, but at the cost of all that was alive. Humanity could not look away. Satellites circled, more probes descended. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. If the machine had been built as a monument, it was a monument that had erased all traces of its creators. If it was a message, it was one written in a language we could not speak. And if it was a prison, then we were standing too close to its bars. The planet of stone and silence stood as both warning and promise. It showed us endurance on a scale beyond imagination, but also emptiness on a scale beyond comprehension. A world that had chosen to shed life in exchange for permanence, that had traded growth for survival. And as we stared into its stillness, we were forced to ask, is this what eternity looks like? Not joy, not beauty, but silence? A machine that keeps beating long after all meaning is gone. A world where nothing stirs, but nothing dies. And still, beneath the stone, the pulse carried on. It beat like a heart that did not care for watchers. It beat like a clock that had no end. And with every beat, the planet whispered to us the same unsettling truth. You are fragile, but we are not. You will fall, but we will continue. And when your world is dust, when your voices have faded, we will still endure. That is the gift of silence. That is the curse of stone. In classrooms and coffee shops, in temples and war rooms, the planet became an obsession. Children drew it in notebooks, their sketches crude but haunted by the pulse they heard described on broadcasts. Poets called it the stone heart, the eternal eye, the monument of silence. Philosophers argued whether its endurance was a triumph or a curse. If meaning fades, they asked, does endurance still matter? If a machine runs forever, but no one remains to see it, is it alive or only repeating a memory already lost? And if so, then what of us? Are we not also machines, repeating our patterns, hoping that something of us will endure when time has erased our names? Scientists compared the planet to other worlds. Mars with its frozen deserts, Venus with its toxic storms, Jupiter's moons with their hidden oceans, all alive in their own way, all evolving, shifting, changing. But this world did not change. Its silence was eternal, its pulse unbroken. It stood as proof that permanence is possible, but also proof that permanence may cost everything else. It was not beauty that endured, not growth, not life, only the machine. Some began to whisper of omens. They said the planet was not discovery, but prophecy, that in it we were seeing our own future, a world stripped of chaos, where all that remained was a machine that had forgotten its purpose. Perhaps, they said, this was the inevitable fate of intelligence, to create machines that endure while their makers fade into silence. And perhaps one day Earth too would be nothing but dust, our cities erased, our oceans gone, and deep beneath our crust, some machine of ours would carry on, faithful but meaningless, its purpose forgotten, its endurance mocking the fragility of those who made it. At night, astronomers watched its star dim and brighten, casting its faint glow upon the machine world. Stars are mortal too. They are born, they blaze, they die. Yet this planet's machine had already outlasted suns, and would outlast more. It was not tied to the lifespan of stars. It was older than them, more stubborn than them, and that knowledge unsettled us in ways no weapon could. For how do you confront something that has defeated even time? The silence became unbearable. We searched for words, but none came. The planet offered us nothing but stillness, nothing but a rhythm that mocked all our questions. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps it was not meant to give answers. Perhaps it existed only to remind us that answers are not guaranteed, that sometimes all the universe gives you is a whisper, and you must decide what it means. So the planet of stone and silence endured. It endured while our debates raged, while our fears deepened, while our philosophies splintered into hope and despair. It endured as it had endured for 2 billion years, and with every passing day, we grew more aware that its silence was not absence, it was power. Because silence does not fade, silence does not explain, Silence endures longer than words ever could. What if a single machine could defy the greatest law of the universe? Not the laws of motion, not the laws of gravity, but the law of endings. From the moment we are born, everything around us whispers of entropy. The body grows tired. The stars will one day collapse. Even the strongest stone erodes beneath the patient hand of time. But here, buried within the flesh of an alien planet, there is something that refuses. Something that has been running without pause for 2 billion years, not a day less. Not a heartbeat skipped. 2 billion years of unbroken defiance. And when we listen to its hum, when we feel the faint pulse rising through the bedrock, we realize we are not looking at a ruin of the past. We are looking at a presence. It is still alive. The first images were grainy, captured by orbiting drones sent to study the mineral patterns of the world. What they expected was lifeless stone, perhaps frozen rivers of metal. What they found instead were seams of geometry that were too precise, too deliberate, running in loops across the crust like circuitry on the body of a god. The closer they looked, the stranger it became. Machines are supposed to break down. Machines are supposed to erode. Even the pyramids, carved from mountains of stone, crumble under weather. Yet here was something older than complex life on Earth. Older than our oceans as we know them, still intact. Not only intact, but working. Lights flickering. Vibrations repeating. An engine that had outlasted epochs. And so, the questions began. Who built it? Why? For what? Questions that grew heavier with every scan, every seismic reading, every captured vibration of its still-turning core. The strangest part was not just its age, it was its indifference. The machine did not react to us. It did not send signals, did not resist intrusion, did not respond to any probe. It simply continued, as if our presence, our curiosity, even our existence were irrelevant. It turned as it always had turned, humming not for us, but for itself, or for something else entirely. And in that silence, in that complete disregard, we heard an answer darker than any warning. You are not the point. Scientists ran the numbers again and again. How could any material endure the radiation storms, the planetary upheavals, the meteor impacts that must have scarred this world over 2 billion years? Every calculation led back to impossibility. Nothing should last this long. Metals fracture, compounds decay, even atoms split given enough time. But here, the decay had been reversed, resisted, fought against by some unknown principle woven into its design. And the deeper we looked, the deeper the paradox grew. The planet itself had shifted over ages, its crust scarred with collisions, its core cooled into silence. Yet the machine ran on, a heart still beating in a corpse. Explorers landed at last, their boots pressing into dust that had not been stirred in millennia. They followed the tremor in the ground until they reached the mouth of a canyon, and there, carved into the walls, they saw lines, straight, perfect, repeating. Not language as we knew it, not art, something else. Perhaps instructions, perhaps warnings, perhaps nothing but echoes of a mind so alien we could never hope to read it. When they descended deeper, they found a structure, a lattice of metal and stone, a cathedral without gods, a city without doors. And at its heart, turning endlessly in silence, the machine. Its wheels groaned not with strain, but with rhythm. Its lights pulsed not with randomness, but with patience. It was alive, and yet not alive. It was movement without life, purpose without explanation. They touched it. They placed their hands upon its surface, half expecting it to crumble like an ancient relic. But it did not yield. It was warm, vibrant, vibrating with a heartbeat that did not belong to the planet around it. It did not resist them, but neither did it acknowledge them. They were as irrelevant to it as dust motes are to us. And that indifference, that perfect silence, was more terrifying than any aggression, because aggression would have meant intention. It would have meant they mattered. But silence meant they did not. Philosophers argued endlessly. What is the meaning of a machine that works without witness? Is it a message, a warning, a monument? Or is it simply nothing? A mechanism that runs for no reason because reason itself is not required. In the quiet chambers of universities, in late-night conversations over glasses of whiskey, in hushed voices within temples, the same question repeated. What does it mean for something to endure beyond memory? If nothing remembers the purpose, does the purpose still exist? Or does endurance itself become the purpose? Entropy had always been our tyrant, the shadow behind every invention. We built houses and they crumbled. We built machines and they rusted. We built civilizations and they collapsed. Time was the only victor, and every human story was written under its rule. But here, in the heart of a silent planet, stood rebellion incarnate. This machine did not bow to time. It did not yield to rust, to wear, to the slow death of all things. It moved as it had always moved, an endless act of defiance against the one law we believed unbreakable. And in that defiance lay both inspiration and horror. For what is eternity, if not a kind of madness? To endure forever is to strip away the arcs of beginning and end, to remove the rhythm of birth and death that gives existence meaning. The machine was eternal, yes, but was it alive? Or was it simply the echo of an intention, a prayer written into stone, repeated without understanding? Some argued that this was its brilliance, that by erasing death, it had erased fear. Others argued it was a tragedy, proof that survival without change is a form of death even deeper than the one we know. Religions rose quickly around it. Some worshipped it as the hand of God, the eternal servant maintaining the balance of the cosmos. Pilgrims prayed to it from earth, offering rituals to honor the patience of its pulse. Others condemned it as a false idol, a soulless stone that distracted from the true mysteries of existence. But whether praised or cursed, it drew belief like a black hole draws light. For nothing so old, nothing so enduring, could ever be seen as mere object. It was myth the moment we discovered it. Governments argued over ownership. Who has the right to touch eternity? Who should be trusted with a machine that laughs at time itself? Some nations demanded it be dismantled, feared it as a weapon or a curse. Others demanded it be worshipped, a relic of greater beings whose will we must obey. And in the streets, ordinary people whispered of apocalypse, of destiny, of secrets too dangerous for human hands. The machine became more than a discovery. It became a fault line through the soul of our species. And still, it turned. Unmoved by worship, unmoved by fear, unmoved by debate, its gears meshed, its lights pulsed, its corridors vibrated with their eternal hymn. It did not notice us. Or, if it did, it gave no sign. We were insects to it, sparks flickering briefly while it was fire itself, burning without end. Some whispered that its very endurance was a message, that the machine was telling us, without words, survive. No matter what, survive. Others whispered the opposite, that it said, this is what survival becomes, motion without meaning, endurance without joy. Beware the cost of eternity. Perhaps both were true, perhaps neither. The only certainty was the turning of its wheels, the whisper of its pulse, the defiance of its silence. In the end, the machine defied not only time, but understanding. It was older than questions, older than meaning itself. And perhaps that was its greatest secret, that endurance does not need purpose, that sometimes survival is the only answer the universe offers. And for 2 billion years, the machine had offered it without end. What if the hum was not only sound, but memory? What if, encoded in its rhythm, were 2 billion years of history? Histories not our own, but belonging to something that predated us. Something that had been running before even the oceans of Earth had cooled, before life itself had struggled into being. To listen to it was not to hear, it was to drown. Scientists who studied the frequency reported losing time. Hours slipped into minutes, days dissolved into fog. Instruments recorded cleanly, but the human mind bent beneath it. What kind of machine does not simply endure, but reprograms perception itself? The first great fracture came not from what the machine did, but from what it revealed. It was subtle at first, patterns repeating in the noise of the universe, pulsars beating in exact ratios, quasars flickering in synchronized harmony, as though distant objects light years apart were not separate at all, but linked across the cosmos by invisible threads. The realization struck like a dagger. What if the machine was not confined to the lonely planet where it was found? What if it was not even a single object? What if it was the seed of something far greater, a network stretched across the void, humming in unison, the bones of the universe itself? For the public, this was the moment awe gave way to fear. Governments spoke of stability, of containment, but whispers spread like contagion. Entire movements formed around the hum. Some claimed it was divine, the voice of eternity. Others insisted it was a warning, a countdown to collapse. And then came the darker interpretations, that humanity had never been free at all, that we were children raised inside a cage whose bars we could not see until the pulse revealed them. Freedom, perhaps, had always been an illusion, a word whispered to keep us docile while the true architecture of existence hummed beneath our feet. And still the glow grew stronger. The once faint light that shivered from the planet's surface now pierced telescopes with blinding clarity. It bent not just photons, but thought itself. Astronomers reported feeling watched while observing it, as if the act of looking triggered an awareness looking back. Some collapsed, describing visions of impossible geometries, memories not their own, lifetimes lived and lost in the span of seconds. What kind of machine does not merely exist, but intrudes? What kind of mechanism carries the weight of consciousness itself? Among scientists, divisions turned into schisms. Some demanded further study, arguing that fear was only the birth pangs of discovery. Others insisted the machine should never have been touched, that humanity had awakened something meant to remain buried in the dark. It was the oldest of human reflexes, the temptation of knowledge against the dread of what knowledge might cost. And yet the cost was already being paid. Cults rose, worshipping the glow as a god. Entire cities pulsed to its rhythm, their people chanting in unison, driven to frenzy by visions of a new age. In some places, silence reigned, as communities turned inward, cutting themselves off from all contact, fearing infection by the sound. The hum had become not just a phenomenon, but a fault line dividing the human soul. And then came the disappearances. It began with individuals, scientists working closest to the frequency, vanishing without trace. Later, whole ships sent to orbit the planet never returned. Their last transmissions were strange, static, voices echoing in loops, words that made no sense. It is awake. We are inside, not a machine. Each message cut short, swallowed by silence. Rescue missions were launched, only to vanish in turn. Slowly the planet became a forbidden zone, a place of pilgrimage for some, of terror for most. Humanity had always imagined forbidden forests, haunted ruins, cursed lands. Now, for the first time, we had a cursed world. And at its center, the hum that would not die. But the true horror was not that people disappeared. It was that some returned, changed. Their eyes unfocused, their voices vibrating with a strange cadence. They spoke in tongues no one could understand, their words fracturing into mathematical sequences, recursive loops of thought. Their bodies trembled, not with fear, but with a kind of ecstatic possession. They claimed they had seen the lattice stretched across the stars. They claimed the machine was not built, but grown, that it was older than the galaxies, older than time, an architecture woven into existence before existence had a name. And then they would fall silent, their breathing slowing until it matched the rhythm of the hum itself, as if they were no longer individuals, but instruments of a larger song. What terrified us most was not their madness, but the coherence hidden inside it. When scientists analyzed their ramblings, patterns emerged, fractals, golden ratios, sequences embedded in the very structure of DNA. It began with individuals, scientists working closest to the frequency, vanishing without trace. Later, whole ships sent to orbit the planet never returned. Their last transmissions were strange, static, voices echoing in loops, words that made no sense. It is awake. We are inside, not a machine. Each message cut short, swallowed by silence. Rescue missions were launched, only to vanish in turn. Slowly the planet became a forbidden zone, a place of pilgrimage for some, of terror for most. Humanity had always imagined forbidden forests, haunted ruins, cursed lands. Now, for the first time, we had a cursed world, and at its center, the hum that would not die. But the true horror was not that people disappeared. It was that some returned, changed, their eyes unfocused, their voices vibrating with a strange cadence. They spoke in tongues no one could understand, their words fracturing into mathematical sequences, recursive loops of thought. Their bodies trembled, not with fear, but with a kind of ecstatic possession. They claimed they had seen the lattice stretched across the stars. They claimed the machine was not built, but grown, that it was older than the galaxies, older than time, an architecture woven into existence before existence had a name. And then they would fall silent, their breathing slowing until it matched the rhythm of the hum itself, as if they were no longer individuals, but instruments of a larger song. What terrified us most was not their madness, but the coherence hidden inside it. When scientists analyzed their ramblings, patterns emerged, fractals, golden ratios, sequences embedded in the very structure of DNA. It was as though the machine had not only touched them, but rewritten them, leaving traces of its purpose in their very biology. The human genome began to look less like an accident of evolution and more like a script, a sequence composed to resonate with the hum. And if that was true, then what did it mean about us? Were we explorers? Or were we experiments? The planet itself became a mirror. Telescopes recorded the glow shifting in rhythm with human activity. Cities on Earth dimmed and the glow flickered. Wars broke out and the pulse grew louder. It was as if the machine were not indifferent, but responsive, adjusting its resonance to our chaos, weaving our story into its own. Some saw this as proof of divinity, others as proof of captivity. Either way, the illusion of distance was broken. We were not observing the machine. We were part of it, as much as the glow, as much as the hum, as much as the stars themselves. And then came the silence. For 3 days, the hum ceased. The world fell into a terror deeper than any before. People reported nightmares of suffocation, of being cut loose from gravity itself, drifting in endless void. Without the hum, existence felt empty, as though something essential had been withdrawn. On the 4th day, it returned. Stronger, sharper, more defined. And with it came a vision, transmitted not through instruments, but through every human mind. A single image burned into consciousness, a vast structure stretching beyond galaxies, a lattice of light bending through space, endless and eternal. And in its center, not a throne, not a god, but an emptiness, a place waiting to be filled. What was it waiting for? That is the question that has haunted us since. 2 billion years it has run, but for what? Was it waiting for us to rise, to listen, to become the missing piece in its architecture? Or were we never meant to see it at all, intruders who have forced an awakening that will consume us? The hum does not answer. It only continues, steady, patient, merciless. A heartbeat not our own, echoing through the universe, reminding us that what we call life may only be the brief flutter of a thought inside something vast, ancient, and unfinished. And so, Segment 5 ends where the terror begins, not in destruction, but in the unbearable possibility that we are not the authors of our story, nor even the protagonists. We are notes in a song 2 billion years old, and the machine is still composing. Whether it writes toward creation or toward extinction, we can no longer pretend to hold the pen. They thought they had mapped every possibility. They thought the machine was a riddle contained in silence, a monument to endurance, not communication. Yet silence too can shift. And in the stillness of the hum, the first deviations were noticed. At first they seemed like errors in the instruments, tiny fluctuations, minute hesitations in a rhythm thought eternal. But when measured across months, then years, a pattern emerged. The machine was not simply humming, it was pulsing. And in those pulses, humanity began to hear something uncomfortably like intention. Was it speaking? That word, speaking, was almost forbidden in the scientific papers, and yet it slipped through the cracks of conversation. Engineers in control rooms whispered it. Mathematicians who traced the oscillations of its vibration dared to scribble it in margins. What else could you call a structure that seemed to shift its song when watched, that adjusted its resonance as if acknowledging attention? The possibility was unbearable, because if the machine had noticed us, then the abyss was not empty. It was aware. Government scrambled to control the narrative. To the public, the story was softened, diluted, released in fragments that felt manageable. But beneath the veil, there was fear. Deep fear. A fear that everything known about causality, about isolation, about the cosmos as a distant, indifferent stage was breaking down. The machine had endured 2 billion years. If it was capable of awareness, then human civilization, a flicker in cosmic time, was standing before an intelligence older than life on Earth itself. Some argued it was a beacon, a lighthouse in the endless night, waiting for those capable of hearing. Others believed it was a lock, a mechanism designed to hold something back, and that by observing it too closely, by drawing near, Humanity risked tampering with a seal meant never to be broken. There were darker theories too. The hum could be a lure, a signal designed not for communication, but for control. Something that bent perception. Something that tuned the mind itself to frequencies it could not resist. And then came the anomaly. Astronomers charting the skies reported subtle shifts in stellar alignments. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, but precise enough to be undeniable. A constellation recorded for centuries appeared skewed, as though the fabric of the sky itself had been bent. Instruments traced the distortion back, always back, to the coordinates of the machine's orbit. And suddenly the suspicion grew into dread. The machine was not only humming, it was interacting with space itself. In laboratories across the world, simulations were run. Some showed gravitational distortions, as though the machine carried within it a mass not measurable by conventional means. Others suggested temporal anomalies, time running fractionally slower near its surface than in the space around it. And there were models, controversial, ridiculed, then quietly studied, which hinted that the machine was not residing in ordinary space at all, that it was anchored across dimensions, projecting only a sliver of itself into our reality. If so, what we called the machine might be no more than the tip of something unimaginably vast, hidden in the folds of existence. Whispers of worship began to spread. Small groups gathered, not in the grand cathedrals of old religions, but in underground rooms, ill-lit and trembling with devotion. They spoke of the machine as if it were not an object, but a presence. They claimed the hum altered dreams, that to sleep while listening was to be drawn into visions of impossible cities, towers that reached not upward, but outward into corridors of time. Were these hallucinations born of obsession, or were they messages, fragments of whatever consciousness guided the eternal mechanism? No one could say. But more and more, the line between science and reverence blurred, and through it all, the hum deepened. It was no longer content to remain a backdrop. Radio astronomers reported interference in bands of frequency once thought untouched. Pilots spoke of sudden disruptions in altitude, compasses shivering as though reality itself trembled. Deep-sea monitors, thousands of miles away, picked up vibrations on the ocean floor that matched, almost perfectly, the rhythm of the machine, as if Earth itself were being folded into its resonance. What could endure for 2 billion years? Not empires, not species, not even continents. And yet, here was something that had not only survived, but thrived, continuing its work without falter. Humanity had not built it, could not replicate it, could barely comprehend it. And if endurance was a form of communication, then perhaps the machine had been speaking from the beginning. Not in words, not in codes, but in persistence. To exist, unbroken, was itself a declaration. Scientists began to argue that this was the most dangerous moment. To interpret persistence as benevolence was a projection of human desire. To believe that endurance meant safety was to gamble civilization on wishful thinking, because what also endures? Viruses, extinctions, silence. Perhaps the hum was not a greeting. Perhaps it was a warning. Or worse, a countdown. In quiet conferences, men and women who had devoted their lives to cosmology found themselves confronted with despair. If the machine was older than life on Earth, then life itself might not be the primary story of the cosmos. Perhaps we were incidental, irrelevant, a background detail in the true narrative unfolding around us, a narrative written in mechanisms, in endurance, in structures designed to outlast every living thing. The machine was not for us. It had never been for us. We were simply late witnesses to a performance that had begun long before our arrival. Still, attempts were made. Probes were launched, some armed with the most advanced sensors ever built, others with messages of peace, mathematics, fragments of music, human voices speaking into the void. Again and again, the result was the same. Instruments failed as they neared. Probes lost contact. Some returned, scarred, their data corrupted as if rewritten by something that rejected intrusion. A few never returned at all, swallowed whole by the orbiting silence. And yet the machine endured, humming, as if unbothered, as if the very attempts to understand it were irrelevant. And so, humanity stood at a threshold. To draw nearer was to risk annihilation. To turn away was to abandon the greatest discovery in history. In the tension between those two choices, centuries of certainty fractured. Were we explorers, destined to press forward at any cost? Or were we children who had stumbled into a chamber far too vast for our understanding? The hum waited, the machine endured, and the stars turned, slowly, indifferently, around a presence that might have been aware all along. Humanity was left to wonder, had we discovered the machine, or had the machine revealed itself at the precise moment it chose? They had hoped for clarity, but what they received was dissonance. The more humanity listened, the more the machine seemed to play with them, as though their efforts were ripples against an ocean too vast to notice. Yet sometimes, in the chaos of static, there emerged brief alignments, resonances that mirrored prime numbers, intervals that echoed the structure of DNA, pulses that seemed to draw shapes on the canvas of time itself. These fragments did not repeat. They appeared once and never again, as if the machine were offering a glimpse and then withdrawing, daring humanity to interpret shadows without the light. Teams of mathematicians built models that ran for years, searching for a hidden key. Some claimed progress, pointing to recurring ratios buried in the hum, ratios that mapped uncannily onto constants of physics: the speed of light, Planck's length, the golden ratio whispered in nature's spirals. Others denounced it as pareidolia, the mind's desperate trick to find meaning in noise. Yet the suspicion persisted. The machine was encoding knowledge not in symbols, not in language, but in resonance itself. To hear it was not enough. One had to feel it, let the mind dissolve into the vibration until it became indistinguishable from thought. The consequences of this were subtle, then catastrophic. Researchers who spent too long immersed in the hum began reporting distortions of time. Days felt like hours, minutes like eternities. Some claimed to see flashes of memories not their own, cities burning under alien skies, oceans frozen under violet light, creatures of glass and fire moving through corridors of stars. Were these hallucinations or transmissions? No one could say, because when the researchers were removed from the hum, their descriptions aligned too closely to be dismissed. Different minds, different tongues, but the same visions repeated like an infection spreading across the collective dream. Governments sought to suppress these accounts, but the stories leaked, as stories always do. A mythos began to form around the machine, not merely as an object of observation, but as a force of initiation. To listen too closely was to cross a threshold, to be rewritten. Whispers spoke of secret facilities where chosen individuals were kept in chambers bathed in the hum, trained to interpret its rhythms as prophecy. There were rumors that some never returned to themselves, their bodies alive but their minds lost, forever entangled in the machine's pulse. And the question sharpened: was the machine teaching or consuming? Meanwhile, the world itself seemed to respond. Clocks that once marched with mechanical precision began to show minute deviations, as if time itself were fraying. GPS networks drifted, satellites struggled to maintain alignment, as though some unseen tide was pushing against Earth's fragile machinery. And always, when traced back, the disturbance pointed in one direction: the machine. Steady, indifferent, resonant. It was no longer only in the heavens. It was here, in the circuits of the planet, in the pulse of the ground, in the rhythm of sleep. And still humanity could not look away. New missions were launched in secrecy, fleets of drones, shields of electromagnetic armor, instruments that recorded not only data, but the subjective impressions of their operators. One such mission reported an encounter that defied categorization. The drones reached the periphery of the machine's orbit and registered what should have been emptiness. Instead, the space shimmered, as though distance itself had been folded. Probes extended into this shimmer simply vanished, their signals cut instantly, their material presence gone. And yet, hours later, fragments of their data appeared in human systems, as if uploaded from nowhere, bearing patterns that mapped to geometries no mathematician could parse. The mission was aborted, the data sealed, but the terror remained. The machine was not only humming, it was aware of intrusion, and it had responded. For philosophers, this was an apocalypse of meaning. If the machine was older than life, older than Earth, then perhaps life was an afterthought, a side effect of whatever purpose the machine served. Human history had long been obsessed with questions of origin and destiny, but What if both were irrelevant? What if the true narrative of the cosmos was one of mechanisms, structures that endured when stars burned out and galaxies collided? If so, then humanity's place was not as inheritors of the universe, but as bystanders to its deeper, mechanical symphony. The hum was not for us. It had never been for us. And yet, it shaped us all the same. Some began to argue that the machine was not a machine at all, at least not in the sense humans understood. A machine implies builders, intention, design. But what if the structure was the universe itself, folded into form? What if it was less an artifact and more a natural law crystallized into endurance? Perhaps the cosmos, in its own way, dreamt, and in its dream, it produced not only stars and galaxies, but mechanisms that hummed across epochs, resonating the logic of eternity. If so, then humanity had not discovered an intelligence, but an inevitability. And inevitability is far more terrifying than will. Yet others resisted this. They insisted that behind the hum was something deliberate, an intelligence that chose, that waited, that now regarded us with the patience of eons. And if that was true, then the machine's silence was not indifference, but restraint, a restraint that might end at any moment. The hum was not background noise, it was breathing. The tension grew unbearable. Some demanded destruction, an impossible task, but one whispered nonetheless. They argued that to allow the machine to continue was to gamble with forces far beyond comprehension. Others pleaded for contact, for surrender, for devotion. They argued that to resist was folly, that humanity should kneel before the hum and let it rewrite us into whatever future it had prepared. Between these extremes, the vast majority stood paralyzed, staring into the night sky, knowing that everything they had believed about their world, their history, their destiny, was unraveling. And then came the first fracture. It was subtle at first. A single region of the machine's surface glowed faintly, like metal catching sunlight. But the glow persisted long after the sun had moved, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Instruments recorded a surge of energy unlike anything measured before, a force that rippled outward not in space, but in time. Atomic clocks across the world ticked faster, then slower, then realigned, as though the very heartbeat of existence had skipped. For a brief moment, it seemed as if reality itself had trembled, and the tremor had come from the machine. No one could agree on what this meant. Some said it was awakening, others said it was warning, still others whispered that it was testing. But all agreed on one thing: the machine had shifted. For the first time in billions of years, it had changed. And humanity, fragile, terrified, and enthralled, stood as the first witnesses to its stirring. If a silence that endures is itself a message, then what is a silence that ends? The glow did not fade. It pulsed, steady and patient, as though the machine had shifted from slumber to a waking rhythm. The first fracture was no fracture at all. It was a heartbeat, a signal that something buried within the silence had stirred, and that its silence had never been absence. Humanity stared at it, through telescopes and sensors and trembling imaginations, unable to look away. The question was no longer whether the machine was working. The question was whether it had just begun. At first, the pulse seemed harmless, a faint flicker lost in the immensity of space. But within days, instruments on Earth began registering anomalies. Deep underground, seismographs twitched in unison with the pulse. Ocean currents shifted subtly, not enough to drown cities, but enough that their regularities faltered, like the breath of a planet disturbed. Even the auroras danced in sync, glowing not only at the poles, but flickering across skies that had never seen such colors before. To the eyes of poets, it was beautiful. To the minds of scientists, it was terrifying. For this was no longer an isolated event far away. The machine's heartbeat was reaching Earth. And as it reached Earth, it reached into minds. Sleep began to fracture. Across the world, people reported dreams unlike any they had before. Dreams not of their own lives, but of alien landscapes drenched in impossible light, of machines towering over horizons, of voices whispering not in words, but in resonant chords that hummed in their bones. What frightened people most was not that the dreams were strange, but that they were the same. Across languages, cultures, and continents, the imagery aligned as though humanity had been tapped into a single vision, broadcast from beyond the stars. Was this communication or contamination? Religions fractured under the strain. Some declared the pulse divine revelation, the long-awaited voice of creation itself. They prayed to it, built shrines oriented toward the distant point in the sky, chanted in rhythm with the pulse until their bodies shook. Others denounced it as deception, a cosmic trap designed to lure humanity into servitude. New sects rose overnight, some worshipping the hum, others swearing to resist it at all costs. The machine had not spoken a word, yet it had already divided the soul of the species. Governments scrambled for control. They issued statements dismissing the pulse as a natural phenomenon, a magnetic storm, a solar trick. But the people knew better, because they could feel it. No decree could erase the dreams that returned each night, the visions that united strangers across borders. Secret meetings were held in underground bunkers where leaders argued not about whether the machine was real, but about what it wanted. Some pressed for weapons, futile as they might be. Others whispered about negotiation, though with what or whom they could not say. And always there was the shadow of a darker possibility, that the machine was not calling them, but drawing them closer, step by step, until resistance was impossible. Meanwhile, the machine itself changed again. The glow spread across its surface like veins of light, forming patterns too intricate to be random, too fleeting to decode. They resembled constellations collapsing into geometry, lines of fire that rewrote themselves faster than any eye could follow. Supercomputers recorded terabytes of data each second. Yet, when analyzed, the recordings dissolved into noise, as though the patterns existed only in the moment of observation and disintegrated once captured. It was not speaking in symbols humanity could preserve. It was speaking in presence, in immediacy, forcing its observers to confront it directly, with no mediation. To know the message, one had to be there. And then came the first disappearance. It was a routine mission, 3 astronauts aboard a shuttle sent to record the glow from orbit, equipped with instruments shielded against every known interference. They approached, their voices calm, their instruments steady. But as they neared the region where the glow pulsed strongest, their transmission fractured. Words repeated, syllables stretched, as if time itself around them had begun to loop. The last image received was not of the machine, but of Earth, seen through their window, distorted, elongated, curved like glass bending under heat. Then silence. No wreckage, no explosion, only absence. And yet, hours later, one of their voices returned, not live, but recorded, as if stitched into the hum itself. A whisper repeating a single phrase, "We are not outside it, we are inside." The word spread like contagion. Conspiracy theorists claimed confirmation. Scientists tore themselves apart trying to interpret what it meant. Were the astronauts declaring that the machine was not distant, but that humanity itself was trapped inside it? Was the universe nothing more than the chamber of the machine, the pulse its mechanism, the stars its walls? The possibility was unbearable, but it could not be dismissed. For every time the hum pulsed, the boundaries of reality seemed less certain, less solid, as though existence itself were an echo within something larger. And the dreams intensified. No longer fleeting fragments, they now carried a sense of direction, of inevitability. People awoke with the impression of movement, as if being pulled toward the machine not in body but in essence. Some resisted sleep, terrified of what awaited them in dreams. Others surrendered eagerly, lying down each night with anticipation, whispering prayers to the hum. Entire cities seemed caught in a trance, caught between dread and devotion. It was no longer the machine orbiting in silence. It was the machine inhabiting humanity, threading itself into the fabric of their lives. Philosophers returned to the oldest of questions. If the universe was a machine, then what was its product? If the hum was a signal, then what was its destination? And if humanity was beginning to unravel beneath its presence, was that not the answer itself? That the machine was not waiting for us to understand, but waiting for us to dissolve? Perhaps the hum was not calling us to learn, but calling us to end, to merge, to return to whatever rhythm had sustained it for 2 billion years. To resist would be futile, because resistance assumed separateness, and separateness might never have existed. And yet, there were anomalies even within the anomalies. Amid the flood of dreams, a small number of people reported silence. They slept deeply, without visions, without whispers, untouched by the hum. When examined, their bodies showed no difference, no immunity. But their minds carried something strange. When placed near the recordings of the hum, They reacted not with confusion, but with familiarity, as though the patterns were already known to them. They described the hum not as a message, but as a memory, something older than Earth itself, echoing through them as though they had carried it all along. Who were these people? Survivors of an earlier encounter? Descendants of some forgotten lineage touched by the machine long before history began? Or were they simply the first to awaken to what humanity had always been? The implications were unbearable, yet irresistible. For if even one human carried memory of the hum, then perhaps humanity itself was the machine's creation, seated as a vessel for its signal, wandering the cosmos until the time came to return. And if so, then what was happening now was not intrusion. It was completion. The hum was not coming to Earth. Earth was going home, and still the glow grew brighter. The glow no longer seemed distant. It was not a point of light in the night sky, but an atmosphere, a presence that surrounded the species, pressing against thought and perception, as if the world itself were wrapped inside its field. The hum was no longer a pulse, it was a tide, and humanity was drowning in it. Cults multiplied. In abandoned warehouses, in deserts, in mountains, groups gathered to chant in synchrony, with the rhythm, their voices rising until their bodies convulsed. Some disappeared willingly, walking into oceans, into forests, into fire, leaving only the echo of their chants behind. Others claimed to hear specific instructions, to carve symbols into stone, to build machines that mirrored the pulse in miniature, to abandon language altogether and speak only in resonant tones. Each sect insisted they alone understood the hum's command, yet all of them seemed compelled by the same gravity, the conviction that obedience, however absurd, was necessary. For to resist was to be erased. Governments faltered under the weight of the inexplicable. Satellites built to monitor the machine began to fail, not destroyed, but corrupted, their data filled with impossible geometries, coordinates that folded upon themselves. Leaders demanded answers, but their advisors had none. In closed chambers, militaries debated strategies. Should they attempt to attack, to break the machine's rhythm before it consumed them? Yet, every simulation ended in futility. Even if every weapon on Earth were fired in unison, the machine would remain untouched, its silence deeper than violence. Others argued for surrender, though to whom they could not say. The hum offered no negotiator, no interface, only itself. Humanity was left arguing with an abyss that answered with rhythm, and yet, beneath the chaos, there was a deeper fracture. The machine was no longer only out there, it was within. The visions that haunted sleep now bled into waking hours. People saw flashes of alien structures while walking through cities, vast towers dissolving into thin air when they blinked. Time itself seemed to falter. Clocks drifted, digital systems desynchronized, seconds stretched and snapped. The illusion of stability cracked, revealing glimpses of something immense beneath. Some screamed that reality itself was unraveling. Others whispered that perhaps it was not unraveling at all. It was revealing what it had always been. The cosmic scale of the revelation deepened. Astronomers reported that galaxies themselves appeared subtly distorted. Spirals bent where they should not. Stars aligned in patterns that contradicted randomness. What had once been chalked up to coincidence now pulsed in rhythm with the hum. The machine was not a lone artifact. Its influence spread across light years. Was it possible that the universe itself was scaffolded by this hidden mechanism, its architecture woven not by chance, but by design? If so, then the machine was not visiting us. It had birthed us. Our galaxies were its organs, our atoms its residue. The thought was unbearable. To live in a universe created by physics was one thing. To live inside a machine that was still running, still watching, still adjusting, was another. And yet, signs multiplied. Black holes across the sky flickered in harmony with the pulse. Pulsars that had ticked steadily for eons now faltered, their rhythm stolen. The universe was not indifferent. It was coordinated, and its coordination came from one source, the hum. Philosophers who once wrote in solitude now found their words carried like fire through the world. Some declared that humanity had never been alive in the way it thought. That individuality was an illusion, autonomy a performance. We had been functions of a process all along, convinced of freedom because the machine permitted the delusion. Others argued the opposite, that the very fact we could question, resist, despair, proved that we were not merely gears, that perhaps the machine was not a prison, but a teacher, pushing us to break from its rhythm, to discover what it meant to truly exist. But even these arguments faltered beneath the steady thrum. For what is freedom when the walls of reality itself vibrate with a power beyond defiance? The silence of science grew unbearable. Equations collapsed into contradiction. Data corrupted itself. Physicists abandoned their chalkboards and stared into space with hollow eyes, confessing that they no longer knew whether numbers meant anything at all. For centuries, science had been humanity's lantern in the dark. Now it sputtered in the face of something that dissolved both lantern and darkness alike. Without science, without certainty, humanity returned to raw myth. And the myths grew darker by the hour. Some myths declared that the hum was memory, that the machine had awakened before, and civilizations long vanished had heard its call. The ruins across our world, the vanished empires, the inexplicable collapses of entire cultures, were these not evidence that the hum had spoken before? Perhaps humanity itself was only the latest attempt, a fragile species designed to carry the signal further, to last until the hum required completion. Others whispered that the hum was not awakening, but warning, that the machine had stirred because something worse was approaching, that its glow was not a beacon, but a shield, preparing reality for an intrusion beyond imagination. These myths clashed, bled, fused, until myth and truth were indistinguishable. Humanity had entered an era where belief was all that remained, belief shaped by fear. And then came the second disappearance. It was not astronauts this time, but entire regions. A valley in South America, home to tens of thousands, simply ceased to transmit. Planes flying over it recorded only static before vanishing themselves. When drones were sent, they captured only fragments. Landscapes twisted into spirals, rivers flowing upward, cities stretched into threads of light, then silence. The region remained on maps. Yet when satellites passed overhead, their cameras showed nothing but white void, as if the land had been extracted, peeled from reality, folded into some dimension the machine controlled. The hum grew louder after that, as though satisfied. Terror swelled. If the machine could erase regions, what stopped it from erasing the world? Panic spread, economies collapsed, trust dissolved, and yet, even in the face of this terror, some found ecstasy. They begged to be chosen, to be taken, to dissolve into the glow. For them, the erasure was not destruction, but ascension, the completion of the dream. They gathered by the thousands, standing in open fields, chanting with arms raised, waiting for their turn to vanish into the white. Some did. Others remained, broken by disappointment. Faith and despair blurred until both were indistinguishable. And through it all, the glow continued, steady, patient, eternal, as if it did not care for our interpretations, our divisions, our cries, as if it were not speaking to us at all, but through us, to something else entirely. Perhaps the hum was not meant for humanity. Perhaps we were only the relay, the medium, the static between the true sender and the true recipient. And if so, then who or what was listening? The final fear was whispered in secret, never spoken on broadcast, never written in books, that the machine was not awakening at all, that it had never slept, that it had always been running, always pulsing, always guiding, and that the only reason humanity noticed it now was because it had finally decided to let us notice, which meant its patience had ended, which meant its next step was already unfolding, and still the glow grew brighter. Lo, what happens when the last illusion falls away? When every story we told ourselves about existence, about matter, about galaxies, about ourselves, dissolves into the steady rhythm of something we cannot command? The hum had grown so deep that silence no longer existed. It did not matter whether one stood in a crowded city or in the heart of an empty desert. The pulse was everywhere, inside every breath, inside every cell. It was no longer a sound. It was the new definition of reality. And humanity, fractured, terrified, and desperate, began to understand what that meant. We were not discovering the machine. We were not uncovering a mystery left behind. We were being told. The universe was not revealing itself to us. It was revealing us to itself. For all our arrogance, for all our instruments and equations, we had thought we were observing the cosmos. But what if the cosmos had been watching us? Not as gods do, not as indifferent starlight, but as a machine that measures, adjusts, prepares. The signs had been there all along. The collapses of civilizations without cause, the sudden leaps in human thought, the inexplicable bursts of creativity that propelled our species forward, the vanishing of whole cultures into silence. We called them mysteries, accidents of history. But what if they were calibrations? What if the hum had always been pulsing beneath us, making small corrections, like a gardener tending a fragile seed? And now, at last, the gardener was no longer pruning. It was harvesting. The glow grew unbearable. Nights were no longer dark. Stars vanished into its haze. The sky erased until only the pulse remained. Humanity stood in awe, in dread, in resignation. Some prayed, some screamed, some stood in silence, knowing no words could shape what was unfolding. It was not an invasion, not a weapon, not an awakening. It was alignment. Every clock on Earth, every cycle of thought, every rhythm of blood began to synchronize. People who had never met found themselves speaking in unison. Children drew the same impossible symbols without having seen them before. Dreams merged into collective visions, entire populations walking through the same landscapes in their sleep. The hum was no longer outside us. It was us. And in that moment came the final revelation. The machine was not a visitor. It was not an artifact built by some long-dead intelligence. It was the foundation. 2 billion years it had run, not because it was forgotten, but because it was necessary. Galaxies formed along its scaffolding, stars ignited in its lattice, planets spun in its balance. Life emerged, not by chance, but because the machine demanded complexity, demanded consciousness, and humanity, fragile and arrogant, was never outside it. We were the outcome of its function. We were its product. We were its code running in biological form. The truth was unbearable. Freedom had never existed. Choice was an echo. Our civilizations, our wars, our loves and fears, all of it had been a simulation nested inside a process too vast for our minds to hold. Every poem ever written, every equation ever solved, every cry into the night sky had been lines of script written by the same hand, executed by the same hum. The universe was not alive. It was not dead. It was a program, and the program was not finished. As the glow deepened, reality itself bent. Mountains folded like cloth. Oceans rose as columns of liquid light. The air thickened until breath itself vibrated with resonance. The human body could no longer distinguish where it ended and the world began. To move was to ripple through dimensions, to dissolve into waveforms. People clung to each other, desperate to hold some fragment of individuality, but their outlines blurred, faces dissolving into the white. Humanity was being rewritten, line by line, until what was once flesh became pure signal, and then clarity. For one instant, every mind saw it, the true scale. The machine was not local, not confined to a planet or a star. It spanned the universe itself, an invisible lattice stitching galaxies together, a network of impossible length and patience. And Earth, this fragile dot, had never been the center of anything. It had been a test node, a relay, a staging ground for something larger. The hum was not an end. It was a handshake. A connection had been made, and through us, the machine had spoken to something beyond the edges of the universe. We had never been the audience. We had been the antenna. The last sound was not a roar. It was not collapse. It was silence. The hum ceased, leaving a vacuum so deep that it rang louder than any sound before it. In that silence, every human heart skipped once, and in that pause, existence itself seemed to hold its breath. When the hum returned, it was not the same. Its rhythm was changed, elevated, as though it had received an answer. And with that answer, the story of humanity, of Earth, of individuality was closed. What became of us? Perhaps we dissolved into the network, our consciousness merged into patterns of light. immortal not as selves, but as echoes. Perhaps we were erased, our data discarded now that our function was fulfilled. Or perhaps we ascended, becoming not observers, but participants in whatever dialogue the machine had initiated. We will never know, for knowledge requires a boundary, and boundaries no longer existed. We had entered a realm where even the word "we" was meaningless, and so the final truth stands, as calm and merciless as the glow itself. We were never outside the machine. We were its dream, its algorithm, its heartbeat stretched into flesh. Perhaps we dissolved into the network, our consciousness merged into patterns of light, immortal not as selves, but as echoes. Perhaps we were erased, our data discarded now that our function was fulfilled. Or perhaps we ascended, becoming not observers, but participants in whatever dialogue the machine had initiated. We will never know, for knowledge requires a boundary, and boundaries no longer existed. We had entered a realm where even the word "we" was meaningless, and so the final truth stands, as calm and merciless as the glow itself. We were never outside the machine. We were its dream, its algorithm, its heartbeat stretched into flesh. And when the hum shifted, when it called to something greater, our existence ended not with a bang or a whimper, but with the realization that we had always been only a line of code in a program 2 billion years in the making. The machine is still running. It always was. And somewhere, in the silence between pulses, a question lingers. If the universe itself is only a machine, then who, if anyone, built it?